The word of the Lord, Hebrews chapter 10, beginning in verse 19. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain that is through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is in the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And with that unforgettable, ominous statement lying there as a banner over the rest of the chapter, he begins to reassure these people. But recall the former days, when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Hebrews chapter 10. Now, with your indulgence, I want to make this sort of a graduation speech. This is a week of graduations and graduation parties. How many have been to some event related to graduation in the last 45 minutes? I mean, it's amazing. But I hope that all the graduating students will listen to this with both ears and an open heart. If you're a Christian, I probably don't have to convince you why life is hard on this planet. The fall of man bent everything out of shape, especially people. It's impossible to find a life on this earth that is without danger, risk, and pain. And even if you are blessed with perfect health, which some of you young people apparently have, at least nothing beyond what an aspirin or a Band-Aid could handle, then I promise you, you will undoubtedly get a few painful lumps from some other sources. It could be pain from some natural disaster that you can't avoid, a flood, an earthquake, a tornado, a roommate with stinky feet. It could be financial pain, where your investments don't exactly turn out as wise as you planned. Weeds always grow better than wheat. And, well, maybe next time you should invest in dandelions. Or it's vocational pain, when you try to ascend up the ladder, but it's blocked by a dishonest coworker or an ungrateful boss or a bad economy. Thorns are far easier to come by than thrones. You'll discover all too soon that you accumulate a shadow resume that you don't want anyone to know, written in invisible ink, the jobs you applied for and didn't get, the awards that went to the other guy, degree programs you didn't get into, or things you wrote that nobody wanted to publish, things that just didn't work out like the things that did. Or perhaps the deepest pain, worse than physical injury or disease, is relational pain. Excuse me. A friend deserts you, a girlfriend dumps you, a spouse resents you, a parent neglects you, a son or a daughter curses you. There's no end to the pains you risk when you try to love somebody. C.S. Lewis wrote about that in his book, The Four Loves. The only place outside of heaven where you can be perfectly safe from the dangers of love is hell. There's also the pain of personal failure. Something as simple as a dropped ball can plague a player his whole life. You might know the name of a guy, Noble Doss, who won 2 NFL titles playing for the Philadelphia Eagles. But the play that grips his memory was the ball that he dropped in college that lost the national championship for the Texas Longhorns. 50 years later, he admits, I think about that play every day, and he shares that with tears. Well, that wasn't a sin. It was just something that didn't work out like everyone expected and that he wanted. Try to do something well, and you will inevitably fail to meet the grand expectations of yourself or maybe of someone else. This is the risk of all human endeavor. But of course, without risk, nothing is ever achieved. If you don't run, you can't win. So you play the game of risk. In order to get, well, have you played Risk, the board game? It says right on the box, it says the game of global domination. Well, it's distressing to me that Christianity is all too often advertised, even in Africa of all places, as the path to completely healthy, absolutely awesomely wealthy living, when the truth about following Jesus that we find in the Bible is completely the opposite. Now, I can give you many great reasons to become a Christian, but I can't offer you a pain-free, risk-free life going forward. We've been in Hebrews for almost half a year, and you know by now that our preacher has been writing chapter after chapter trying to convince his Jewish Christian readers not to abandon their faith. But he never once suggests that continuing with Jesus is going to be safer than going back. That would be a lie. I can give you a pretty good reason not to become a Christian, because if you follow Jesus, your pain in this world will actually increase. It's not just religious pain. It's not the idea that you hold some doctrines that are kind of awkward because it's a minority opinion that is unpopular. It's that your faith in Jesus increases all the other sources. That was pretty clear to the early followers of our crucified master. If you became a Christian, you risked your health. Why? Because you could be beaten, flogged, or even killed. You risked your job. You could get fired for your faith. You risked your house and your possessions if you were branded illegal in your community. You risked your relationships, maybe disowned by your family, divorced by your spouse. And you would have even increased your sense of personal failure, because now you would be measuring your life not by the little yardsticks of human comparison, but by standards of perfection. Hopefully you also learn forgiveness. Well, this has to make us question how the church grew both spiritually and numerically during times of persecution. It did. But it's kind of loony from our vantage point that people chose to associate with a religion that was on the number 1 most hated list, exactly where Christianity stands even today. By now, 70 million Christians have died for this despised faith, half of those in the last 100 years. Today, a Christian dies for his faith every 5 minutes. So 9 or 10 of them by the time I'm done speaking, depending how long I preach, and we will never hear their names. How ironic that non-Christians throughout the centuries have felt so threatened by the nitwits who propagate the gospel of Jesus that they feel it's necessary to kill them off lest they go on spreading something that supposedly no one in their right mind should have believed in the first place. It was kind of a long sentence to say, why are they doing this? Why, if it doesn't make any sense, then what's the big fear? Well, in America, we have gotten used to the notion that Christianity should or would be treated respectfully by non-Christians. This was never the thinking of Jesus. He said, if they hated me, they will hate you too. Well, here's the hard truth for all of you graduates. In recent days, we have been slammed with the increasing awareness that the honeymoon for American Christians is over. Your Christianity going forward is going to be the painful cross Jesus said it would be. We're completing 350 years of Christian dominance in America that has fooled us in a massive way into thinking that this world is our home, and we can expect to be prosperous and treated well and well thought of and influential, to be safe and comfortable, if not entertained. That myth, that dangerously crippling, unbiblical mindset must now die, and it should die. Just this week, during a confirmation hearing, 2 senators decided that anyone who believes Jesus is the only way to be right with God and that not believing in Jesus condemns someone to hell is not fit to hold public office in America. Wasn't that long ago that it was hard to get elected if you didn't believe such things. But now, if you believe in Jesus the way Jesus intended to be believed, according to Bernie Sanders, you are really, quote, not someone who is what this country is supposed to be about. This is a peek into our future, your future. And that's why a passage like what we get in Hebrews today is so necessary. It talks about not turning back, but instead persevering when your faith gets you into trouble. And now it's going to get you into trouble as never before. It actually tells you what you need to know if you're not going to bail on Jesus when following him gets increasingly costly. 2 things. The first tells the readers to review their Christian past, look back. The second tells them to preview their Christian future, look forward. And the first thing is what we learn in verses 32 to 34. You must recall the former days when God sustained you through hard struggles, even as you joyfully risked everything earthly to identify with the sufferings of others. The idea here is simple. When these people were younger, they didn't hesitate to suffer for Jesus. Our preacher has just warned them how desperately dangerous it would be to abandon the Lord. And you remember Nate's sermon from 2 weeks ago in the last passage. I think he said the main point, reject Jesus, expect judgment. But it's interesting that our writer, just as he did in chapter 6 when he also shared a strong warning, he follows it with a word of reassurance. And he's going to let these people know, you guys are not the abandoning type. Look how you suffered for your faith in the past. You endured. And so it says, but recall the former days when after you were enlightened, and so for some of these readers, that could go back 15 plus years when they first trusted in Jesus as their Messiah. But look, when the lights came on for them spiritually, the lights went out for them socially and culturally. They became aliens in their own town, among their families and their community. And so we get something different, not reject Jesus, expect judgment. It's receive Jesus, expect suffering. Either way, there's pain. That's what Christianity meant in those days. And so he says, recall the former days when you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. How could they possibly forget such days of conflict? The good news is that they endured those days. They didn't cave in. And if we're right about who these readers were and where they were, readers in Rome before AD 65, some of them would have been around then during the anti-Jewish and therefore anti-Christian pressures under Emperor Claudius. He expelled Jews from Rome just before AD 50. His reason or excuse is recorded by Suetonius, the historian. They were constantly indulging in riots at the instigation of one Christus. Sounds a lot like Christ. And the presumption is that the riots were evidently the result of the tumult caused by the introduction of Christianity into the Jewish colony in Rome that rocked the boat in the Jewish community when they started preaching Christ. And so, according to F.F. Bruce, this would coincide with the eviction of Priscilla and Aquila and would inevitably have been attended by widespread looting together with many other kinds of insults and indignities. And so we hear about these. In verse 33, it describes them. Sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, like being dragged out into the public square, made an example of, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. So they suffered in 2 ways, direct and indirect. The direct one, the hammer that fell directly on them. And then secondly, the pains that they risked because they would not abandon their persecuted friends, some of whom were evidently imprisoned. They chose to do the opposite of what the disciples of Jesus did when Jesus was arrested, when Peter and the gang just ran. So verse 34 says, "For you had compassion on those in prison." This would be some of those that were mistreated, that you refused to abandon. You had compassion on them, evidently visited them, evidently brought food to them. They would have probably died in prison without help. You had compassion, heartfelt sympathy. What they felt, you felt. It's the kind of thing you read about in chapter 13, verse 3. We'll get to that in a few weeks. "Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them." And so they took the risk of being in prison themselves by visiting their brothers there. And now here's the kicker that shows faith was fully at work with them, and you joyfully accepted, the word means welcomed, the plundering, the confiscation, the seizure, the looting of your property, your possessions, all your belongings, including maybe your house being burned down or repossessed by the bank or whatever. Joyfully welcomed? Question: how many of us would do a little happy dance if we got home from church today only to find our windows broken out, our rooms empty, and a for sale sign in the front with Century 1 on it? Well, it's 21 now, I think, but Century 1. Or when we got home, there's an N for Nazarene spray painted on our door in Arabic so that the terrorists can come back and rape and pillage at their leisure. I'm wearing one of these pins to remember those that are being targeted by the ISIS guys in Iraq. And I also have a bracelet on here from Open Doors that says, "One with them." We're to remember these people and realize that this is real and happening even in our own time. But would we be so happy if this happened to us? Now, this is the great message of this passage. For graduates and everyone else who is staring down the barrel of future persecution, how do we become the kind of people who break out of apathy and our addiction to ease and plenty, who risk our possessions and our very lives in the cause of love and good deeds, and who serve God in adversity with great joy? How does that happen? Not service and suffering as a miserable duty, but a major delight. This seems so radically different from the way we think so naturally. And I know that joyful attitude does not come naturally in any century, but how do we stir up one another to become people like this in a world that is in its misery is trying to make us so miserable? How do we become people full of joy when the worst is being dealt our way? We learn the answer right here. We do so by regularly, repeatedly, relentlessly insisting that the end of verse 34 is true. So he says, you joyfully accepted or welcomed the plundering of your possessions because you knew something that the world does not know, because you had something that the world does not possess. And so it says, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one, versus a worse possession and a pathetically temporary one. Now, when I think back to my early days as an American Christian, I can't actually think of a whole lot of suffering in my life. I mean, I was in a tight religious community. I'm pretty much sheltered from anything like that. But some of you who became Christians from non-Christian backgrounds perhaps had to endure quite a bit of ridicule and isolation. Maybe you're the only Christian in your family. Maybe you have somebody to deal with all the time who makes fun of you for what you believe. There are many degrees of persecution. In a recent article on the Suffering Church, FaithWorks listed 17 degrees of persecution that you could face for practicing your faith, and you may have faced these in your past, and he wants you to think about that and how you endured that, how God sustained you through that. And so there's everything from, number one, disapproval, somebody that just kind of looks at you like you're one of those Christians, all the way down to martyrdom, murder and execution. And in between is ridicule and pressure to conform, and then loss of educational opportunities, economic sanctions, shunning, alienation from the community, loss of employment, loss of property, physical abuse, mob violence, harassment by officials, kidnapping, forced labor or sex trafficking, imprisonment, and then physical torture, and finally, killing itself. Now we know from chapter 12 that these readers had not yet had to face martyrdom for their faith. Those days are coming for them as Nero starts to light up his killing machines. Now, if you honestly can't do the first thing, that is recall the past part, because up till now you haven't really stood up for Jesus. Maybe you haven't needed to in the way that brings any ridicule, even certainly not martyrdom. Well, then you could, I suppose, skip number 1 and go on to number 2. But for these Christians, they needed to review the past and realize that the courage that they had displayed and that helped them endure persecution with joy came from this knowledge of something that was just as true now as it was then. And so whatever you're facing now, he says, don't turn back, because look how you endured suffering in the past because of something you knew. Now you light that up again. And so the end of verse 34 is the bridge to the rest of this chapter and the introduction to the whole faith chapter that comes next, the amazing chapter 11 of Hebrews. So here's the second thing they needed to do. They needed to look into the future just as they did in the past and know the certainty of the rich reward that comes to those with a persevering faith. You must cherish the future days, knowing confidently that God rewards you even now with a better and lasting possession. And so what I'm going to do is show the transition here at the beginning before I start reading in verse 35. He says, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one, therefore, do not throw away your confidence, your boldness that makes you stand up for the slings and arrows of adversity, the boldness to enter into God's presence through the blood of Christ without turning back, which has a great reward. A great reward. So let's stop on that. That's the better and lasting possession, in other words. Now, the root of that sort of thinking comes from Jesus himself, the 8th beatitude. Jesus said, happy are those persecuted in the cause of righteousness, because it's to them that the kingdom of heaven belongs. Happy are you when people insult you and persecute you and circulate all sorts of evil lies against you because of me. Start rejoicing and be very glad. Be very glad means start jumping for joy, because your heavenly reward is huge. You see the same reasoning. For this is the way they persecuted the prophets who preceded you, who, of course, we honor completely. Matthew 5, 10 through 12. Your heavenly reward is huge. The reward means that God sees you. God approves of you. It involves triumphing with Christ over death, triumphing with him over the world and the flesh and the devil. It means being co-owner of the heavenly kingdom. You were hated on the earth, and now you're going to own it. You will be satisfied with eternal, changeless righteousness. It means access to God forever. It means having Jesus acknowledge you as his own in the Father's presence. Abba, this is my friend Bill. He stood up for me, and now I stand up for him. Jesus wants you to know that what you give up for him is nothing compared to what you will receive from him. And in fact, what he has already given you, because this is a possession you have as your inheritance right now. Persecution and happiness go together, as long as you're convinced that the reward is huge. And the better and lasting possession has got to overtake your mind at some point. If that better possession is great enough in your thinking, you will be even able to rejoice over the loss of your earthly possessions. Now, if you're a recent graduate, that's probably not saying a lot, because you probably don't own a whole lot. You know, someone's going to take my laptop from me. But let's say you don't own a house yet, and you have a few other things, probably it's not a great loss. But what about your health? And what about your relationships? And what about a lot of other things? But you don't get the heavenly reward if you quit on Jesus. And so he says in verse 36, for you have need of endurance, like you had when you were first enlightened. That's why you don't throw away your confidence. Throw away means to just take something that's worthless and cast it out because it doesn't do you any good anymore. No, you need that confidence, because confidence brings you endurance, and you've got to have that endurance. So when you have done the will of God, that is faithfully followed the Lord in spite of all the suffering, you may receive what is promised. There's the reward again. There's the better lasting possession. Now the question is in the air. The same one that hangs over this whole sermon that we call Hebrews. Will you turn back, or will you proceed joyfully with faith? Now, the preacher is going to quote from the Old Testament, a little bit of Isaiah combined with some Habakkuk, mostly Habakkuk, a 7th century Jewish prophet. And it lays out two alternatives, faith or shrinking back. Which will it be? And for your information, one is not as good as the other. The prophet is concerned for how long Judah will have to wait until God's interests are vindicated on the earth. But here is God's answer. And it culminates in the second coming of Christ, called the coming one. If you read the Gospels, you realize sometimes Jesus is called the coming one. Okay, so here we have verse 37. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. And this is talking about the second coming of our Lord. But in the meantime, until he comes, you got to wait, and waiting takes faith. So he says, but my righteous one shall live by faith. Now, while you wait, various trials come, and lots of difficulties are there. If he shrinks back, withdraws in fear, quits his faith, my soul has no pleasure in him, which is wow, what an understatement that is. And you could just draw right across that. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Now, the last part refers then to the believer who must wait, will not shrink back. God's righteous person, called to trust God, even though he can be tempted to wonder if Jesus will ever return to fulfill all his promises. You can trust God to show up when the time is right. And that leaves, again, those two alternatives. Are we shrinkers when the fire of persecution gets hot, or do we stick with our faith? So in verse 39, the preacher reassures his readers that he and they, he uses the word we, stand together with the believers of all times, many of whom will be mentioned in the next chapter. But we are not of those, I'm reading verse 39, we are not of those, that is in the ranks of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but we are of the ranks of those who have faith. Like we will read in chapter 11, like Abel and like Enoch and like Noah and like Abraham and on through the list. We're all like them and preserved their souls. Now this verse acts like a summary, and this is how I try to put this together. And that is this, that endurance is a mark of those who have real faith. They don't shrink back. Without faith, our souls will be destroyed, because if you shrink back, it says you are destroyed. So this is not a mark. If you're a real Christian, then you will persevere and you will not be destroyed. But here's the point, and this is transitions to all that I want to say in application. That is an infinitely larger risk, that is to be destroyed, than what you could ever face with persecution. Now, you will endure risk, whether you're a Christian or not. As a Christian, you will need to persevere in the face of danger. The persecution that comes. J.I. Packer said, it needs to be said loud and clear that in the kingdom of God there ain't no comfort zone and never will be. That's a scholar talking. But if you're not a Christian, the risk you face is infinitely greater. You may avoid the hands of the persecutors, but you'll have to deal with the hands of the living God. So in your unbelief, you risk missing out on eternal blessing and facing instead the eternal wrath of a living God. It literally says it is a fearful thing or a terrible thing to fall into the hands of not the living God, but says a living God. And it puts the stress on the fact he's alive. This is a God you actually have to deal with. This is a God who exists. Now, when the risk of faith is calculated, it's good to remind yourself of Pascal's wager. Pascal was a French mathematician who lived in the 1600s. What he proved mathematically was the sheer foolishness of choosing not to believe in God. He didn't use math to prove that there is a God, but he says if there is a God or is not a God, and you have to choose one or the other, it is foolish to cast your vote against God. And this is how he explains it. And I'm not going to tease out his whole argument. I think it's fascinating, and I love to think about it. But the gist of it is pretty easy. If you choose against God, and it turns out you choose wrong, there is a God, then there is infinite heaven to lose and infinite hell to face. But if you choose God and you happen to be wrong, there isn't a God. Then you lose nothing you wouldn't have had anyway. You still get your natural life. It's obvious where the greater risk lies, so choose God. Now I have to add one more consideration for the purpose of this message to graduates, and it has to do with the weighing of risks. If you choose God and you're wrong, you won't have had the same life on this earth that you would have had as an unbeliever. It's not like, oh, you get the same thing. A Christian life will have been harder, and maybe even shorter if you are killed for your faith. And if it turns out that there is no God to reward you, then you have, some would say, wasted your life. In spite of the fact that you might have served people and done all of this, but if there is no God, there's no purpose to any of that anyway. This is the great alternative I hold out to you. The great choice that faces you this very day and perhaps every day is whether you can truly believe that all the pains that you have to endure because you're a Christian will be worth it, because there actually is a God of great reward, a better and lasting possession held out to you from the hand of a living God whom you trust and believe and who loves you and wants to reward you. Now, if you believe and God is for real, then suffering is a small thing when compared to the glory that is coming. But you will have to give up your whole expectation of comfort and safety in this life. I'm talking to graduates here. Going forward, you're going to get educated. You're going to start a job. You're going to look for a spouse. All of this sort of stuff is coming. Can I talk to you for a few minutes about the cost of all that? I want you to consider the truth of what Jim Elliot wrote when he was a young man. Jim died for Christ as a missionary in Ecuador when he was just 28 years old. Is my son Stephen here? Are you here somewhere? Open? There he is. Some of you don't know Stephen. Could you stand up for a second? I'll embarrass you. Can you imagine? Stephen, and his middle name is Elliot. He was named for Jim Elliot. Also 28. While Jim was still in college, he wrote in his journal, "He is no fool who gives up or gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And you will have to decide whether Jim Elliot, a brilliant and talented young man, wasted his life, just 28 years old, on the shore of the Carare River to the arrow of an Alca native that he had come to save, or whether he did not waste his life, but rather invested it. Now, work with me on a takeaway today. There are 4 parts to this. The first part is about idols that hold you back from a life lived full out for Christ, full of courage, full of joy, full of faith. I wonder if you can spot an idol when you see it. It's time for confession. Now, I'm talking about idols here because, well, I don't see any idols in this passage. Idols are staring at you all over the place. Because here's the deal, that the Bible actually gives you a lot of reasons to shun idols, chiefly because they rob God of glory. The God you're supposed to love with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But the thing I'm concerned with here is that idols lead to weakness when it's time to stand strong. Israel, as an example, lost battle after battle every time they got lured again into idolatry. 1 John 5 is about having faith that overcomes the world. And then it ends that chapter, in fact, the whole book of 1 John, very abruptly with this simple command: "My little children, keep yourselves from idols." It's so important. And the issue is that there is no victory or power related to standing firm for God unless we give our idols up. And so I'm going to start right there. I'm going to say, here you are as a young person, and you're going to try to prepare for this coming storm. And the storm is going to kill you and wipe you out if you're not prepared to be strong. And if you're holding on to nothings, that is what idols are called in the Old Testament, simple nothings, then you're going to be blown over. And so what are the things that could make you shrink back from your confidence and its great reward? What stuff are you reluctant to risk for the sake of the gospel? You see, idols set you up to fail. Now, usually when we think of confession, we think of when we have done some sin. We've told a lie, or we've had lustful thoughts, or something we have done. What about all the okay things in our lives that we have elevated to a place where we depend on them, we honor them in the place of God? Those, as far as the Bible are concerned, are the bigger sins, where our love and dependence on God himself has been compromised. And we all have idols that we struggle with, that we regard as maybe better than our promised inheritance. Those are very present tense things that we lean on. And these idols rob us of the great reward because they silence us when we ought to speak up and suffer. We're shrinking back instead of standing forth. We face the truth about our true gods when we are tested by opposition to our faith. Let me illustrate. I'll give you several options here. And you could write down probably thousands of idols, but here are some possible categories. Things related to your health and your beauty. We think pain or disfigurement is going to rob us of something we actually need. So when persecution ramps up in America, are you going to deny Christ rather than take a beating? Something that's going to mar this finely sculpted body that you've been working on in the gym for so long. You may avoid physical pain, but at the cost of losing the great reward. It's a test whether we really know God or not. Now remember, you're at risk of getting pain from all of these sources anyway. Not just because you're a Christian, but the question is whether you want to go through them alone, whether you will face them without a clue about their purpose. How about your job and advancement? As a Christian, are you going to compromise your morals or stay silent about your faith in order to make your career work? Same thing could be said about money or possessions. About popularity. You want everyone to admire you as the best at something, and so you get used to cheating, just little things. They call it the A-Rod temptation, taking steroids to pad an already impressive ability as a baseball player. And so for you, let's say the pressure comes when somebody calls you an idiot because you believe there was a flood, or because you believe there was an Adam, or because of anything. You believe the Bible. So you, an intelligent, well-read, thoughtful Christian person, being branded as a Neanderthal by the academics around you, is this when you toss your Bible and save your reputation? I want to say that if you never speak out and defend the truth as an undergrad, you are not likely to stand strong when your whole career is on the line. It is time to count the cost. The idol of popularity. Or how about relationships? What about when you have a boyfriend? He's an idol if you have to sleep with him to hold on to him. Or even if he simply keeps you from doing the most God-honoring thing with your life. If you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and deep in your heart you know that you ought to break up with that person, but you can't. You're in the grip of an idol. And when the day of testing comes, this person will lead you to failure. Jesus said he came to divide, even families, father against son, son against father. Luke 12, verse 53. So, start with this. Confess to God any idol you have. Say the truth about it. Agree with God about it. That's an idol. I can't have that. And then here's my challenge. So this is number 2. Have you ever joyfully surrendered all these things in advance before the day comes when they are taken from you literally? Just give them to him now. Give them all up, like smashing and burning idols, only this is something that goes on in your soul, on the inside, maybe on your knees. This is something we all do. It's not like the monks that, some super spiritual people made vows of poverty or chastity or whatever. No, Luke 14 talks about this. It's talking to all disciples. Jesus says, if you don't hate your father and mother and your wife and children and brothers and sisters, and yes, even your own life, you can't be Christ's follower, his student, his disciple. That is hate in comparison to your love to Christ. And he says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Anyone who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Now, whatever actual loss God may call you to endure in this life, could be much, it could be little. Being a Christian means being willing and ready to let everything go for the sake of Christ. And quit depending on your stuff to sustain you, to excite you, to make your life what you want it to be. Get down on your knees and give everything to God. Have you ever done this? And take your health and your job and your possessions, your popularity, your relationships, your hobbies, everything, and pray a prayer of relinquishment. Lord, this is all yours. I don't own anything. I don't need to protect it. I'm sorry for how I got angry when someone scratched my precious car. Even my body doesn't belong to me. It was bought with a price, a high price of Christ's own blood. I want to worship and honor you alone. All that I am and ever will be, I owe to you. I belong to you. All my stuff is actually your stuff. And if you remove it all from me, it doesn't matter because all I need is you. So do whatever you want with it with me. I refuse to keep on living for myself. Amen. Now, will you do that? When you do, you will have taken the best step you can take to prepare for coming persecution. You might remember a statement I made to our youth back in 2013. I say that and then I just have to chuckle because you don't remember what I said 4 weeks ago. But anyway, it's the plight of the preacher. But here's what I said. And we printed this a week later to be just put on your refrigerator and think about it. Yours is a generation. I'm talking to youth. Yours is a generation that will be tested for courage more than any previous generation of Americans. To endure, you will have to be better Christians than your parents have been. If you stand for Jesus your whole life, I'm fairly certain some of you will do jail time for your Christian convictions. You will all suffer financial loss and loss of prestige. You will either be known as the generation that rose to the challenge of radical faith, or you will be intimidated and hounded into silence and compromise so that you become the generation that makes the church irrelevant. I'm calling you to make your life more than ordinary church going. I'm asking you to see your future as an adventure of radical risk-taking for Jesus. It's going to cost you to be a Christian like no other generation of Americans. It's going to cost you to stand and say, I believe in Jesus. Now, if you hesitate on that, then you need to do something serious, some serious computation. So there's confession, challenge, and now computation. Computation, adding things up, assessing whether avoiding those losses by going back or by hiding your faith can really make up for the loss of eternal blessing, the great reward. Compare the risks of being an open, confessing Christian with the risks of unbelief. Go back to Pascal's wager. Review the words of Jim Elliot. Or, more powerful yet, the words of Jesus. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his own soul? The answer is zero. Are you ready to say Jesus was lying when he made that calculation? The way you live as a kingdom risk taker, either taking risks or not, how silent you are or how vocal you are when it's time to stand up for Jesus, that already shows how you have added things up. The way you've added it up, is it the same as Jesus or is it different? This is called counting the cost. The gospel comes with a warning label. Sort of like the football helmets made by Schutt Sports. I don't know if you know about that, but they make helmets for the NFL. And on the helmet and on the instructions it says, warning, no helmet system can prevent concussions or eliminate the risk of serious head or neck injuries while playing football. To avoid these risks, do not engage in the sport of football. Well, the gospel looks like a good thing. You should be doing this gospel thing. But right on the gospel, it says this: to avoid the risk of discipleship, do not engage in following Jesus. Don't get involved if you're not willing to be hurt. The gospel will make you live forever, but it could also get you killed. You can avoid this risk, but you'll have to go to hell. Ask God to open your eyes to see the superior value and the eternal duration of your future reward when you're finally home. The better and lasting possession. Now, how do you compute such a thing? You just read your Bible. It's easy. If you just know your Bible and believe it, you can stake your whole life on it. And then the last thing, celebration. Confession, challenge, computation, and now celebration. Where does the joyfully come from? In a life of pain, the life of the cross bearer. Is it possible even to thank God when you are persecuted? Jesus said you should jump for joy when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Well, let's just say it's a command. Well, how do you do this command? This is an emotion. And the emotion comes from three things. First of all, confirmation, because here it is. When you are persecuted, it's a sign that you're doing something right. God's work in you is raising the hackles of the enemy. And if we're the real thing, we'll get pressure. And so when you stand bravely without compromise, you're showing God is really in you. Secondly, opposition helps you grow in your faith. Is that not what we want? A workout for our faith muscles that makes us more like Jesus. And I hope you realize already that God is really not so interested in your success or your GPA or degrees or your fine job or finding the perfect spouse. He is passionately interested in your maturity. He wants to see you like his son. And then opposition also increases your joy because you have been counted worthy to suffer for his name. Acts 5:21, the disciples have been severely beaten. They go away, singing and rejoicing. They were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. What a sweet paradox when dishonor becomes an honor. That's the honor of being treated as Jesus was. That is when you break into your happy dance. You have to remember that Jesus himself suffered. And to do what he did is the righteous thing and the joyful thing. He took a risky mission trip, and he died before he reached home. To us, we might call that a tragedy. For him, it was a triumph. He suffered not to save us from suffering, but among many other things, including saving our souls, to teach us how to endure suffering with purpose. And so we come here to the Lord's table. It reminds us over and over that the Jesus path involves suffering and sacrifice. My question is, will you invest yourself or will you waste yourself? You graduate, you have dreams. God has dreams for you too. A lot of them involve exercising faith in a triumphant way in the face of many sufferings. You waste whatever you refuse to invest. It's like the guy in the parable who had the one talent. What did he do? He buried it and lost it. You can't afford risk. You can't avoid risk, but you can choose what risk you will take. How foolish to risk the possibility of eternal pain by pursuing for a few decades the safe life that is a mere delusion. Are you a real Christian? Some wise person noted that a ship in harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. The key to a real unwasted life is not living safely, but living faithfully. Jesus said, whoever wants to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake in the Gospels will save it. That's the invested life. In his novel, But Your Land is Beautiful, Alan Paton tells the story of Robert Mansfield, who was a headmaster in a school in South Africa during the days of apartheid, that cruel system of racial segregation. And when Mansfield's school was barred from competing against a black school, he finally took a stand against apartheid and he resigned his post. And a friend said to him, you will be wounded. Do you know that? And Mansfield replied, pointing to heaven, when I go up there, the big judge will say to me, where are your wounds? And if I haven't any, he will say, was there nothing to fight for? I couldn't face that question. If you fight for the honor of God, wherever you go, the Lord will go with you. Think of chapter 13, verse 5. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Even in poverty, or even if you are unjustly imprisoned like Paul was, the Lord stood by him. I was in a filthy prison in Liberia a few years ago, not as an inmate, hopefully, but visiting one. Howard Johns was with me. Howard's sitting back here. Now, you don't want to be locked up there. I mean, buckets on ropes pulled up food to the inmates in infested cells, and buckets were let down with waste and excrement. Inmates that were well behaved, however, would get some yard time. And while Howard and I were standing there, a young man ran up to me and asked, are you Bruce Stabbert? Well, I wasn't sure if that was a good thing under the circumstances, but Howard was there, so I couldn't lie. Well, the young guy was ecstatic. I mean, he went on to explain how he had been falsely accused of theft and had been locked up without a hearing. And even his family and friends hadn't known where he was until recently. And he said, for some reason yesterday, I asked my friend to bring me my Bible and the certificate you awarded me at the end of the seminar I attended that you taught in Monrovia years ago. And at this point, I can't remember if he ran to get it or asked someone to bring it to him, but sure enough, there was the certificate with my signature scrawled on it. And then he explained why he was so happy to see me. He said, now here you walk into this prison the very next day. I know God knows where I am. I thought I was lost in here. And actually, I'm not sure how I'm going to get free, but as long as God knows where I am, I can't be anything but okay. And so I prayed with him, and when we walked away, I realized something else. For all this to work out as it did, God had to know where I was too. Well, I want you to think about it, you graduates. You wonder if you have what it takes to stand firm in the storm that's coming. You don't. But God does, and he will be with you. As we had it in chapter 10, verse 23, a few verses back. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, because he who promised is faithful. And maybe you're like me. I would rather live my life knowing God is with me and knows exactly where I am, even if it's in the pits of persecution, than live a life for my idols and wonder each day if I'll meet something and have to handle it all by myself and shrink back because of fear and be destroyed. This is the basic choice of all generations of Christians. Now, I've got an assignment for you, and it's very simple. What we'll be preaching on in the next 4 weeks, and you don't want to miss this, is the great list of faithful men and women from Hebrews 11. I want you to read this chapter this week, sometime before next weekend. Begin noting the great company of those who would not shrink back, but who had faith, who preserved their souls. And note how each one was rewarded by God himself. Aim to be one with them. This is my great prayer for you. All you sweet graduates here at Fellowship Bible Church, as you go forward, that someday if a chapter is written of the faithful, that your name would be on it, of the one that would not give up, but persevered because of faith. Let's pray. Dear God, it is our great privilege to be among the faithful, if we are. This will be tested over and over. It is tested today in small ways, but as life goes on, we may face the privilege and the joy of suffering for the name. Build in us a sense of the amazing largeness of the reward that awaits us, so that it may propel us into that kind of radical, joyful discipleship that is our heritage as true believers. I pray for each graduate. Fill them with true faith. Those that have gone along kind of with the church thing, and they've been around, and they can't think of why they wouldn't follow it, but they don't really have much of a heart investment in the truth. I pray for their heart to be drawn in the strongest way to the love of Christ and the reality of the truth of your word. Bless them in that, O Lord. Amen.